Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. Now that we are finished with the Dressrosa arc, on this episode we are going to be reviewing it as a whole and give sort of my overall thoughts on it, as well as the impact it has on the wider story as a whole. Alright, so since this arc is such a behemoth of an arc, I'm going to divide this sort of review up into more manageable pieces, starting with the story, plot, and pacing. So I think the story of Dressrosa was actually really good. Despite how it may have came off while listening to some of the previous episodes going through each episode, I think it's one of the better arcs in terms of storytelling. There were so many amazing moments, moment-to-moment scenes that really stick with you long after the conclusion of this arc, simply due to how compelling it is. Even when you boil it down, it is a very simple story, I would say, and the plot kind of rehashes its structure from Arabasta, but it works for me. Even with all the characters and the half dozen separate plot lines, I was still able to follow each and every one of them without ever really losing track of them, so credit to Oda for that. Obviously I have my criticisms, but I think the story of Dressrosa, being tyrannically ruled by Doflamingo, and the twist that the bright and bubbly sort of Disney-esque appearance of the island initially, and it turning out to having an incredibly dark reason was genius and genuinely unsettling, especially when Frankie first confirms this suspicion with all of us when he's talking to Kuros as the toy soldier. And all the twists and turns that some you could see coming, while others were genuinely shocking and surprising, I think were all done really well. I also love the aspect of the story that tied the island and its citizens to their story, and how they all play a major role in the story, as well as the overall themes, which we'll get into a little later. But that aspect really gives this arc a sort of grander sense of scale compared to many other arcs where it's much more contained to just a handful of central characters. However, the other side of the coin when it comes to a story that is this rich in information, lore, plot, and characters is the horrendous pacing. And I'm not even talking about just the anime. The manga's pacing is not stellar either. It's still a little bit more tolerable in the manga because you can adjust the pacing depending on how fast you read, but it is certainly criticism worthy, and the anime only exacerbates this issue tenfold by how it adapts it. Dressrosa in the anime is borderline unwatchable sometimes, and I've already talked about this many times throughout the episode rewatch podcast, but even I, an extremely diehard One Piece fan, as you probably have noticed, had to stop watching the anime weekly about 2/3 of the way into this arc because it was just getting unbearable seeing how little progression per episode there was. It was just frustrating. And I feel like this was a situation where Oda had so many ideas that he wanted to cram into this arc that it got away from him a bit. And his editors maybe needed him to rein him in a little bit. And that is honestly what I believe really affected the pacing of this arc, was because of the sheer number of characters, plot threads that he introduces. Even this arc had 4 separate flashbacks that somewhat intertwined, but there was the King Riku flashback, the Kuros and Rebecca flashback, and finally the Law, Corazon, and Doflamingo flashback, which you could argue was 2 completely separate flashbacks mashed together, because you had the whole Doflamingo and Rocinante and the Doflamingo family flashback. That I would say is all contained in a story, and then you have the sort of the flash forward with Doflamingo, Law, and Rocinante, and the whole thing with the Ope fruit and everything. And then you also get a brief Sabo flashback at the end of this arc. So technically there's like 5 different flashbacks that all are crammed into one arc. Not to mention the insane number of new characters that Oda had to build up for the purposes of the current story or for future relevance. One thing that became incredibly apparent once you look at the finished arc is why Oda had to devote so much screen time and page time to the individual Colosseum warriors, is because he needed the time to develop each and every one of them so that we would care and want them to be part of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. Now, don't get me wrong, I really love the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, but the pacing of this arc is really adversely affected by their inclusion, especially the sheer number of them. There are so many of them. And then you have the rest of the Don Quixote family that all needed to be introduced and built up to some extent, as well as the citizens of Dressrosa. But because Oda was told by his editors to kind of compress the Greenbit arc and Dressrosa into one arc, he had two separate civilizations and cultures he had to introduce and flesh out, with the humans in the Dressrosa people and the Tontara people. Then you've got the Marines and the world government with the introduction of Fujitora as a new Marine admiral, as well as CP Aegis Zero. Then you have the Revolutionary Army folks getting involved too, with the introduction, or the reintroduction, I should say, of adult Koala and adult Sabo. Needless to say, this arc had an absurd number of characters to cover, and there aren't even just like insignificant, like one-off characters. These are all major players that needed development and screen time. Even after he cut the Straw Hats in half and essentially ignored any development for the samurais, like Kinemon and Kanjuro, it still was so much. Now, with that being said, though, moving on to the characters, I loved these characters. I don't think there's a single character I disliked. Even the ones I was supposed to hate, I hated them, but not because they were written or developed poorly, but because they were designed to be hated. And it worked. The only one I was a little disappointed with, like I mentioned, was Diamante. I don't think we got enough time with him to hate him enough, but even then, I'd say that Oda still made his defeat to Kyros very satisfying. But I think it could have been better, is my point, and I mentioned that in the episodes where we covered those points in the story. The Don Quixote family as a whole were funny and threatening, all at the same time, but they were a mixed bag for sure. I think Oda had to sacrifice the Don Quixote family a little bit to devote more time to the heroes and the allies. So, like, Laoji, Jola, Mach Vice were all a little generic and bland because they didn't get as much screen time or development. But on the other hand, you had characters like Sugar, Pika, Senor Pink, who were all incredible. And then Dellinger and Treble were kind of sitting there in the middle. They had their moments. They got enough screen time and development, but at the same time, they were also not quite as memorable, aside from the fact that they were just annoying as hell. Oda does make them all very memorable, though, with their designs, their abilities, and personalities, some just more so than others because of how much involvement they had in the story. Now, Rocinante and Fujitora were also great additions, and easily two of my favorites in a huge group of new characters. Both of them showed what it means to be good Marines, and as you all know, I really love that archetype of characters in this story, and none exemplified this more than these two. I love that in the end, Rocinante, or aka Corazon, didn't do the right thing out of a sense of duty to the Marines or loyalty to his blood relatives, but out of sheer compassion, which I think is so beautiful, and that is then reinforced in the present day with Fujitora, aka Isho, who is somewhat bound by his duties as a Marine Admiral, but finds almost every possible way to circumvent that, to do what he knows is the right thing to do. Now, tying back to the overall theme that Oda is trying to convey with his story is that it's not about any of those statuses. What it comes down to is to follow the compassionate choice. These two, across decades, beautifully convey this in their own distinct ways. Law and Corazon's part of the flashback until very recently was, in my opinion, the best flashback in the story, and it is still the second best in my eyes. Of course, we'll get one that just it blows out. I mean, I would say it blows this one out of the water, but it is somewhat close, I guess. It not only did an amazing job of showing us what kind of monster Doflamingo was, but also, even in a world filled with cruelty and evil, all it takes is for one kind person to show a lost boy love and belonging, for it to ripple into something greater, to the point where he becomes instrumental in taking down that evil monster and saving several different nations and a huge number of people. It's so beautiful, and Corazon's sacrifice is still one that is incredibly heartbreaking, but one filled with hope and optimism in the form of Law. Even he never shows it, but Law definitely has that hope and optimism now, I believe. The royal family, I think, were also very compelling and well written, each with their own arcs and stories, and each time their time to shine, they were all incredibly meaningful and satisfying. King Riku having to live with his failure in protecting his family and people, as well as Viola enduring the torture of having to align herself with the killers that overthrew her family, Kuros failing to save his wife Scarlet, and fighting to survive as a toy while raising Rebecca, and Rebecca herself fighting back to get stronger and so that she can save her family and her country as well. And it's funny going back to the idea of one act of kindness having ripple effects. It reminds me that Rebecca buying Luffy, and ultimately deciding not to kill him and him, resulted in making a very powerful ally in Luffy for her that would ultimately save her, her family, and her home. And of course, things were already in motion, but I do think this, when she bought him that bento, did play a role in Luffy fighting to protect her family during the final battle. The only real criticism I have about Rebecca is her absurd design for a 16-year-old girl, as well as just how often the anime would remind us of her relationship with Kuros. Like, 1 or 2 flashbacks was enough, but they really didn't need to remind us and show us this flashback every time these two were on screen, or even if they were both not on screen at the same time, just one of them on screen. It just kept showing the flashback, and the manga did this too. It wasn't just the anime. I think because the arc became so long, Oda had to keep reminding us so that we would understand what was going on. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of clunkiness to Oda's writing in this arc, because I think this is the first arc where he was kind of in over his head a little bit in terms of the story and characters. Of course, the other standout characters were the Colosseum Warriors, or the newly dubbed Straw Hat Grand Fleet members. These were some of the funniest and coolest characters of the arc. For me, Bartolomeo and Cavendish are easily the two standouts, which makes sense since Oda devoted the most significance and screen time to them. Bartolomeo especially is freaking hysterical, as essentially he is the stand-in for us, the fans. And it's funny how, or almost scary how in tune Oda is with the pulse of the fan base, because he captured that essence so freaking perfectly. It's funny and also scary at the same time. The other members were also really fun in the limited screen time as well, with Leo and Sai being kind of the secondary significant members. But again, the issue with introducing this many characters in one arc is that in order for all of them to get the appropriate development and time, it really ate into the pacing of the arc and slowed the progression down significantly. It's hard to say how I would fix it, because I don't really want to lose any of these characters, but I also, you got to do something about the pacing. It was bad. I guess it's a bit of, growing pains for expanding the world building and lore. And I think it is interesting because, I think the editors were kind of concerned about, would One Piece grow too long if they didn't start compressing some stuff down, which is why we got, Punk Hazard being crunched down. Then we get, into 2 islands with a fire and an ice island being squished together, and then now you've got Green Pit and Dressrosa also being squished together. So I think by this point, One Piece had been going for so long that his editors were trying to make sure that Oda wasn't extending One Piece to the point where it was becoming untenable. But I think also at the same time, it's kind of, I don't know, hurt the story a little bit in that regard. Now, let's move on to the themes and lore, because this was a big one in this arc, obviously with such a long arc. So moving into the next part of the review, all about new lore and themes introduced, I want to first talk about the main themes explored in this arc. There are actually a lot of different themes covered in this arc, but I think I want to focus on the 3 big ones, at least in my opinion. These were the 3 big ones. Those are, things are never as they appear, family versus loyalty, and compassion versus justice. These specifically because they not only add to this specific arc, but also add to the overall story of One Piece. Firstly, things are never as they appear is an obvious one, as it pertains to the idea that Dressrosa is introduced as this sort of idyllic, happy, and prosperous country, but underneath it is being propped up by all sorts of evil, whether it's imprisonment, slavery, tyranny, and oppression that is kept hidden from everyone. And this is also perfectly, precisely how the world government operates too. To most normal citizens, the world is peaceful and has order, but deep down, the only reason that this exists is because the world government controls everything with an iron thumb with their military goon squad, the Marines, and their Black Ops assassins, the Cypher Pol agencies. This theme goes even beyond that, though, with the characters almost everyone is not who they initially appear to be. King Riku is not the king that betrayed their peoples, while Doflamingo is obviously not the benevolent hero that everyone thinks him to be. Kuros surprises everyone who he really was. The Straw Hat Grand Fleet members surprised me at almost every turn. They begin the arc as antagonists and rivals, and some even viewed as dangerous, but eventually they all turn out to be standout guys that we all grew to love. And similarly, even on the Marine side with Fujitora and Sengoku, we got to see a more compassionate side of them, which also bleeds into the second theme that I want to quickly go over, which is compassion versus justice, because this is a big one in the grand scheme of things, because this is something Oda has been trying to build since he introduced the character of Kobe pretty much in the first episode, or the second chapter. This is the direction that the Marines need to eventually go, but is that possible? And Fujitora was an amazing vehicle to explore this, as he is literally one of the most powerful people in the world, both in terms of strength and status, yet his humane justice is something that is often at odds with the goals of the world government and the Marines, who want to maintain power and control at any cost. So how do you balance this? Isho gives us a glimpse of what this is like. That answer is humility, like being humble and recognizing that you may not always have the power or the right to do as you want, which is juxtaposed by Doflamingo's insane amount of arrogance. Isho probably could have defeated Doflamingo, but at what cost? He knew that the people had to earn this in order for the Riku family to regain its throne and not have the Marines bail them out, perpetuating a reliance on a system like the Shichibukai system that was already incredibly broken. Not only that, but Isho showed that the Marines' ideals of putting everything above maintaining order and power is wrong. Sometimes you have to have the humility to understand that people are the most important thing to protect, and not your own reputation and your own status. Sometimes you have to look stupid to do the right thing for people. This leads into sort of the third theme that I want to talk about, family versus loyalty, because Corazon understood this better than anyone. Law and Corazon's bond and story captures all three themes very well. Corazon wasn't afraid to look silly or stupid if it meant that Law felt safe and loved. He didn't care that he was chased out of a hospital after hospital, or how much Law or the other Don Quixote family members mocked him. He knew what the right thing to do was and always followed his heart. And funnily enough, he's called Corazon. And that is something we all love about him. Family versus loyalty is an interesting one, because this theme isn't really one or the other. Corazon actually defied both. He rejected his blood family in Doflamingo, saying just how dangerous and evil he is, but he also betrayed his oath to the Marines by abandoning his mission to save Law. And the real message of this theme is that family is based neither in blood nor loyalty. It's love. That is all you need to be a family. Law will tell you that even though they aren't blood related, he views Corazon as a father, maybe even more so than his real father. And this can be seen in Rebecca's relationship with her father Kuros as well. It didn't matter that for the most of her life, she was being raised by someone she thought was a completely unrelated toy. To her, he was her father because he showed her nothing but love and care, and for her entire life up till that point. And of course, this has always been a huge theme in One Piece, as many of the Straw Hats are from found families that aren't blood related, and they themselves are now a found family that aren't related. Once they found each other, and that family grew even larger with the addition of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet. But once again, that alliance isn't built on some bureaucratic loyalty oath, which Luffy immediately rejected. Instead, it's an alliance once again built on mutual respect and love, that whenever anyone needs each other's help, they will be there, not out of some obligation to a loyalty, oath, or blood relations, but out of love. And Oda has always used his stories to teach us about how the world and people are very complicated, using much simpler stories to convey that to younger readers and us. And I think this one is important, that we look at, people and situations from an open-minded lens, since nothing is what it seems at the outset. People can surprise you in both negative and positive ways. Oda has always had very specific messages that he wants to convey in his stories, and he does that through the themes he chooses to explore in his stories so that we can engage and digest them in much easier ways. And sometimes doing the right thing isn't about following the rules rigidly, but to take a step back and look around to see if, is this helping or hurting people more? And I think that's an important question to ask sometimes. All right, so next we'll talk about the lore that was dropped in this arc. I mean, because there was so much in terms of just overall world building, story progression. It's mind blowing. Like anytime this was dropped, it was crazy. So, like, first off, Doflamingo being a celestial dragon. I think this was hinted at, but it was finally confirmed, and it was definitely a big one because I think when you look at Dressrosa and Doflamingo, you can clearly see that it is a microcosm of the entire world. And so seeing Doflamingo as a celestial dragon and seeing how he sort of mimics the way that the world government and the Gorose and the celestial dragons sort of operate, you can kind of get to see like what it's going to take to defeat them. Secondly, the D-clan being the natural enemies of the gods or the celestial dragons in this scenario, I think was another interesting thing, as well as Law himself being revealed as a D-clan member and his importance to the story. Like, all of that is really interesting because now it creates this scenario or this situation where the D-clan and Luffy and all of these people with the D initial essentially have like a connection and a purpose specifically being built to defy the world government and the Gorose and the celestial dragons. But you also wonder, like, how does Blackbeard fit into this? Like, he is a D as well, but he clearly is not on the same side as a lot of these other people. Now, the other thing that's interesting and related to this that we can't really get into as much because of spoilers, but the Ope Ope fruit possessing the power to grant eternal youth at the cost of the user's life. Now, the Ope Ope fruit was heavily focused on in this arc, and for good reason. It's a really cool power. It's insanely overpowered. Law, who possesses it, is really cool, and when he uses it. But this ability definitely is like that gun. What is it called? The Chekhov's gun. This is something that eventually will need to be paid off and be used at some point if Oda has introduced it here, because this is a huge thing. And I've talked about like what sort of my thoughts are on this, and again, I think that this was potentially used in the past for some reason as well, but I can't really get into that here. The other big thing that was revealed here was Kuzan joining the Blackbeard Pirates. This one was shocking, and it's kind of like just dropped in there casually too. It's never really like focused on or anything. It's just like thrown in as a side in a conversation. But yeah, Kuzan joining the Blackbeard Pirates as one of their leaders is pretty crazy. But again, you're not going to convince me that Kuzan has turned evil. I honestly think he's in there undercover for whatever reason, because I don't think Kuzan is a bad guy, and he never is seemed like that. At least that's my thought. A couple other really interesting lore dumps is Nolan having history with the Tontara. So that's really cool. And in fact, you can I love the connection that it was already foreshadowed that he met, these little people. And so, yeah, I really like that Nolan is still having this important role in the story. And for seemingly at the time during Skypiea, such a random inclusion in a flashback and in the story, but Nolan has been proven to be a really significant figure. I'm very curious to see what other things Nolan will actually end up influencing in the future. Now, obviously, the building of the Grand Fleet, that was a huge one, because now this establishes Luffy as almost nearly like an emperor. Like, he is pretty close to becoming an emperor, I feel like, in terms of his power and resources. He's probably not nearly as strong as any of them. I still, even at this point in the story, I couldn't see him defeating the likes of Kaido, Shanks, Big Mom, maybe Blackbeard, but even then, yeah, it was kind of up in the air. And speaking of Kaido, the proper introduction of Kaido was insane. That was probably, to this day, still one of the best, if not the best, character introduction in the series, where he just jumps off of a sky island trying to off himself, and then he just gets back up and annoyed that he didn't. And then he not only that, he lands in front of three worst generation members, and you're left on this cliffhanger. And his character design is insane. He is this monstrous hulking beast of a man who can't seem to die. But yeah, that was an incredible addition, and obviously now we know that they're probably going to go after Kaido eventually after this at some point. Now, speaking of the worst generation pirates, we also get to see what's happening with them and all of their sort of exploits and seeing where they are. And they're all in very interesting places because a lot of them have either aligned themselves with an emperor or are facing an emperor. So a lot of the worst generation members seem to be headed on a collision course with the emperors, which makes sense because it's basically the new generation taking on the old generation. And then significantly as well, Fujitora being introduced as the new admiral. Obviously since the post time skip era started, we had no idea who was going to replace the two admirals that left their seats, and we finally got one of them. And it did not disappoint. I love Fujitora. He's my favorite admiral by far. But yeah, it does introduce an interesting dichotomy between Kizaru, Fujitora, and then whoever Ryokugu ends up being. And obviously, I already know who Ryokugu is or what he does. But yeah, it was still a very long mystery as to where that three dynamic would be changed from the original three admirals. And Fujitora is a very refreshing new character with a pretty insane power too. He's basically I don't even know what he's a corollary to. He kind of reminds me of Magneto a little bit, even though Kid is obviously the equivalent to Magneto's powers, but I feel like Fujitora uses his powers a lot more like Magneto does. It's interesting. And then speaking of now getting to the Straw Hats developments, Gear Fourth is interesting because, as you know, I'm not the biggest fan of Gear Fourth. I don't hate Gear Fourth by any means, but it's probably my least. Well, actually, no, it's probably my second least favorite. Gear Third is still my least favorite, but Gear Fourth was a very interesting because it turns him into this almost this mechanical transformation. He's he's like a tank or a jet. He feels like a machine almost the way he moves, and he's super powerful, but at the same time it comes with an insane drawback of he can't use it for very long, and when he does, it drains him crazily. And so it's like the benefit and cost both are amplified so much more compared to his Gear Third and Gear Second. Now, obviously, like he did with Gear Second and Gear Third, he's probably going to get better at using it and become more efficient and more optimized, because now he can use Gear Second and Gear Third without the drawbacks of either of them. But yeah, it'll be interesting where they take Gear Fourth, because it is an incredibly powerful transformation, but also he can't use it for very long. And when he does, he's basically sitting duck for a long time. 10 minutes is a long time to just be out, in a fight. Now we also have God Usopp. This was such an amazing sort of turn of events because Usopp, kind of like Buggy, he's not failing up, but Usopp is definitely succeeding. Everything he does, he's earned. For sure, but I just love the idea of God Usopp being a thing. And it's such an amazing thing. And the fact that his wanted poster is now God Usopp with a $200 million or 200 million berry bounty is just incredible. And then we move to Zoro, who can now use armament haki on his swords, bringing him one step closer to Mihawk and maybe eventually making his own black sword. I mean, he's got Shusui right now, but maybe he can turn all three of his swords permanently black. But yeah, that'll be an interesting new development and just another power up for Zoro. And then the last lore dump that I kind of wanted to mention was Sanji's Only Alive wanted poster. This was also very interesting because it sets up a lot of mysteries for the next several arcs in terms of what is the deal with Sanji? Are the theories, of him being royalty true? And it was a really fun way to end the arc. Now, speaking of the end, to wrap things up, since this review is getting a little long, I just kind of want to go over my general impressions and thoughts on the arc. Dressrosa is definitely a very divisive arc in terms of quality. Some people think it's too long and convoluted, as well as paced really poorly to the point where this is sometimes the arc that makes people jump off of One Piece entirely, and I honestly can't fault them for it. It's a very valid criticism to the point where I even stopped watching the anime weekly. Now, of course, I read the arc in the manga consistently from week to week, but even then, I did feel the story was dragging at points, especially in the beginning of the arc. The first act is incredibly so because it has so much to introduce and establish. The multiple flashbacks, while they were necessary and very good, sometimes even great, they interrupt any sort of momentum the story builds each time one is introduced. And to preserve the surprise of certain elements, Oda had to place them in very awkward places, particularly the Law, Corazon, Doflamingo flashback, where we're finally getting to the part where Doflamingo is, finally ready to be taken on, only to have a long flashback start. And I also think Oda kept faking us out too much. Many times as a reader or viewer, you'd think, okay, here we go. Luffy is going to face off against Doflamingo finally, but nope, he has to face a string clone, or nope, he has to face Bellamy, or nope, he has to deal with Treble, or nope, he needs to recharge. Like, see what I mean? Then when you finally get to Luffy fighting Doflamingo, it seemed incredibly rushed because he's ran out of time. Now, Oda has been one to devote a lot of energy for these. He hasn't been one to devote a lot of energy for these long, drawn-out fights. But this time, it just felt unsatisfying because anytime the fight with Doflamingo would get going, it would be interrupted in some way. And so by the time it gets going, it's already time for Luffy to down him with that one final hit. And it just seemed really weird pacing-wise. And now Oda would get better with this in the next few arcs, and he would go on to write probably my favorite Luffy fight in 2 arcs from now. But when you get to the 3rd arc from now, I feel like all of these issues kind of come roaring back. If you've seen the series, you know what I'm talking about. And I know it sounds like I don't like Dressrosa, but that couldn't be further from the truth, as I love Dressrosa. Despite all of its narrative pacing issues, this is still a fantastic arc. And if you read it in the manga, it's actually really good. If the anime decided to adapt this properly, I think the anime could be great too. It's just that not only could the anime not be adapted close to the manga, it actively ruins it between the flat and low quality animation and the atrocious pacing. It really does make the viewing experience in the anime terrible. Now, I'm not blaming Toei and their animators for this one because it's just the reality of the business. They needed to keep up with the insane weekly schedule while trying to keep as much distance between the manga and the anime, since this is about the time Oda began to really slow down his output a bit due to being overworked and his health kind of starting to decline. And because this arc was so long, they couldn't fit any natural fillers in, so their only choice was to elongate every little bit that they could. And it unfortunately made for a really poor viewing experience. But Dressrosa is still among one of my top favorite arcs for all the amazing moments, the characters, and story progression that it introduces. So yeah, you kind of have to take the good with the bad in Dressrosa. But overall, I still think this is a really strong arc. I really hope one day, whether it's from Toei Animation or from the new Wit Studio remake, that we do get a proper readaptation of Dressrosa, because I think it is the one arc that deserves it the most, given how vital it is to the story of One Piece and just how good the story is, even if it is delivered in a somewhat hard to digest package. But yeah, that's kind of my overall thoughts on Dressrosa. Let me know what you guys think. If you have any thoughts, I would love to hear from you. But yeah, so the next 2 episodes we will be going into 2 cover stories. So one, we'll talk about the cover story that takes place kind of after Punk Hazard and before Dressrosa, one focusing on Caribou And then the next podcast episode will be another one on Jinbei and what he's doing kind of during that time as well. And the funny thing is, they both kind of intertwine a little bit too. So yeah, look forward to that. And then after that, we'll have to go through some fillers before we can actually get to the main story again. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, send me a like or a comment. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing. Check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast for updates of when I post new episodes and see pictures of my manga collection. And of course, as always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out to listen to my podcast. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye!